Tonight, we are going to call it something else. We are going to call it complicity, and we are going to follow that silence. From the parlor to the slave quarters, from the antebellum South to the present day, from the diaries of plantation wives to the memoirs of the enslaved women who survived them. And we are going to understand exactly what that silence cost, who paid the price, and why it still matters. This is dark truth, and the truth has been waiting long enough. Before we can understand why plantation mistresses stayed silent, we have to understand the world that trained them to do it. The antebellum South, the decades between the early 1800s and the Civil War, was a society built on a series of fictions that required constant maintenance. The central fiction was that enslaved people were not fully human, but supporting that central fiction was a whole architecture of smaller lies about the nature of the plantation household, about the relationships between enslaved people and the families who owned them, and about the character and virtue of the white women who managed those households. White womanhood in the antebellum South was constructed as a kind of sacred institution. The plantation wife, and we should note that most slaveholding households were not the grand estates of Hollywood imagination. Many enslaved only a handful of people, was expected to embody a very specific set of virtues. She was to be pure, devout, gentle, obedient to her husband and God, in roughly that order. She was to be above the ugliness of commerce and politics and violence. She was to represent the moral center of the home. This was, of course, an impossible and contradictory demand, because the home she was supposed to represent as a moral center was built entirely on violence. The enslaved people who cooked her food, raised her children, tended her garden, laundered her clothing, and built the wealth her family lived on. They were kept in that position by constant, systematic, legal violence, the threat of the whip, the reality of family separation, the auction block, the patrol system that hunted down anyone who tried to escape. None of that violence was hidden from plantation wives. They were surrounded by it, but the fiction of their moral purity required them to be above it, to not engage with it directly, to manage the enslaved people in their charge through a kind of polite authority, giving instructions, enforcing expectations, while the real machinery of terror was left to their husbands, the overseers, the legal and social systems that upheld it all. And so plantation wives learned from girlhood not to see what they were seeing, not to name what they knew, not to speak of things that would shatter the fiction of the gracious household. The legal system made this easier, or rather, it made resistance nearly impossible, under the doctrine of coverture, which governed marriage law across most of the antebellum South. A married woman had almost no independent legal existence. Her legal identity was absorbed into her husband's upon marriage. She could not own property independently. She could not enter into contracts. She could not sue, or be sued in her own name in most circumstances. She had no direct claim to her own wages if she earned any, or to the property she brought into the marriage. Divorce existed, but the social consequences for a woman who sought it were devastating. She would lose her children in most cases. Courts almost universally awarded custody to fathers. She would lose her social standing. She would lose access to the household and income that kept her alive. And she would be blamed. Whatever her husband had done, the woman who left him would be judged as the failure in the marriage. This was the cage in which plantation wives lived. It was a cage made of law and custom and social expectation, and it was gilded enough, comfortable enough in many cases, that women who had grown up inside it sometimes could not see the bars. Meanwhile, the enslaved women who lived on the same property had none of these protections. Flawed and insufficient as they were, they had no legal personhood at all. They could not marry in any legally recognized sense. They could not own property. They could not testify in court against a white person. They could not refuse. They could not report. They could not run without risking their lives and the lives of everyone they loved. Into this world, where one woman had almost no power and another had none at all, walked the plantation master. And what he did with that absolute power inside the walls of that household and in the slave quarters beyond it was by design invisible, protected by law, enabled by silence, and witnessed daily by the wife who sat in the parlor with her Bible open on her lap. Let us be precise about something, because it matters enormously. Plantation mistresses were not ignorant women, living in blissful unawareness of what was happening on their own properties. They knew. The historical record makes this undeniable, not as speculation, not as inference, but in the actual words of the women themselves, preserved in diaries, letters, and memoirs that survived the Civil War and the century that followed it. Mary Boykin Chestnut is perhaps the most famous of these voices. The daughter of a South Carolina governor and the wife of a Confederate senator, Chestnut kept a diary throughout the Civil War that has become one of the most studied documents of the antebellum and wartime South. She was a woman of extraordinary intelligence and literary skill, and she was deeply aware of the contradictions of the world she lived in. In her diary, Chestnut writes with barely concealed anguish about the reality of what she called the evil of the plantation household and the sexual exploitation of enslaved women by white masters. She describes sitting in church, looking around at the mixed-race children on nearby plantations, children whose features bore unmistakable resemblance to their white fathers, and feeling a burning shame that she couldn't fully name or direct. She understood that every plantation household was, in her words, a patriarchal institution, but she also understood what that patriarchy meant for the women, both white and black, who lived inside it. She wrote that Southern women were surrounded by a harem of enslaved women, and that every white man lived at the mercy of his own unchecked desires. She was not subtle. She was writing in code, but barely. Chestnut was not alone. The letters and diaries of plantation wives from across the South reveal a consistent pattern, a coded language developed over generations for speaking around a truth that could not be named directly. References to the trouble with the master, or those children who look so like him, or what goes on after dark in the quarters. They knew how to signal awareness without making an explicit accusation, because an explicit accusation would have required action, and action would have destroyed everything. Gertrude Clanton, Thomas of Georgia, is another voice the historical record has preserved. Thomas kept a diary for decades, from her girlhood through the Civil War and beyond. She was a slaveholder's daughter and a slaveholder's wife, and she was, by the standards of her time and class, an educated and reflective woman. Thomas wrote about the sexual dynamics of the plantation with a candor that is remarkable for her era. She acknowledged, in entries clearly written for no audience but herself, that enslaved women were subject to the will of their masters in ways that no woman, white or black, could openly discuss. She wrote about the children on nearby plantations with the careful distance of a woman who had learned to observe without reacting. And then she wrote about her own household, not directly, never directly, but the subtext of her diary, read carefully, is the diary of a woman who is living in close proximity to something she cannot name and who is using the act of writing as a way of processing what she cannot say aloud. These women were not oblivious. They were trained in a very specific kind of deliberate blindness, the ability to see clearly and to act as though they had not seen. That is a learned skill. It is also a choice, and it is a choice that had consequences that extended far beyond the walls of any one household. But to understand the full weight of that choice, we have to understand what they were choosing not to see. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women in the antebellum South was not occasional. It was not incidental. It was not the product of a few bad men in an otherwise decent system. It was structural. It was economic. It was built into the legal and social architecture of slavery from the very beginning. Let us start with the legal foundation, because it is important. Under the laws of every slaveholding state, the children of enslaved women were enslaved regardless of the race or status of the father. This was enshrined in the legal principle partus sequitur ventrem. The condition of the child follows the condition of the mother, a Latin phrase that encoded a monstrous reality. An enslaver could rape an enslaved woman, and the child produced by that rape became his property. He had, in effect, bred more wealth for himself through an act of violence. This was not a loophole that the system failed to notice. This was the system working exactly as designed. Slave traders' records, actual ledgers, sale documents, and correspondence that have been preserved in archives across the South document this reality in economic terms that are almost incomprehensible in their coldness. Enslaved women were appraised not only for their labor capacity, but for their reproductive capacity. The term that appeared in these records was breeding. Women who had already demonstrated fertility, who had borne children, commanded higher prices. Young enslaved girls were appraised with notes about their potential future childbearing. These were not abstractions. These were real women, with names, with families, with fears and loves and hopes that the slave economy treated as irrelevant. But the economic logic of sexual exploitation was only one dimension of the violence. The other dimension was about power, about the assertion of total dominance over every aspect of an enslaved person's life and body. Historians who have studied plantation records, alongside the testimonies of formerly enslaved people collected in the decades after emancipation, have documented how sexual violence was used as a tool of social control on the plantation. The rape of an enslaved woman sent a message to her, to the enslaved men around her who were powerless to protect her, to the entire enslaved community, that there was no domain of their lives that was their own. No safety, no sanctuary, no body that could not be claimed. Enslaved men who tried to protect the women they loved from this violence risked savage punishment. To defend an enslaved woman against her enslaver was to challenge the fundamental premise of slavery, that the enslaved had no rights that the enslaver was bound to respect. Men were beaten, maimed, sold away, or killed for attempting it. The system was designed to render black men powerless to protect black women. That powerlessness was not an accident. It was a feature. Plantation wives were present in this world. They managed the domestic labor of the enslaved women who were subject to this violence. They assigned them work. They dealt with them daily. They saw the aftermath. They saw women return to their work visibly shaken. They saw the fear that moved through the quarters when the master's attention fixed on someone new. They heard the crying at night that the daylight was supposed to erase, and some of them, not all, but enough that the historical record documents it repeatedly, directed their response not at the man who held all the power, but at the women who had none. There are documented cases of plantation mistresses ordering enslaved women beaten after suspecting their husbands had shown them favor. Cases of women being sold away, separated from their children, sent to the Deep South, traded to strangers because the mistress found their presence intolerable. Cases of enslaved women being assigned the harshest, most punishing labor on the plantation as punishment for the crime of being noticed by the master. The enslaved woman was victimized twice, first by the man who assaulted her, then by the wife, who punished her for it. This is one of the most painful dimensions of this history, and it is one that has been least examined because it challenges the comfortable narrative that positions white women as fellow victims of the plantation system rather than as active participants in the violence of it. Nothing made the truth more visible, more undeniable, more present, more impossible to escape than the children. On plantations across the antebellum South, enslaved children were born who bore unmistakable physical resemblance to the white. Men who enslaved them. They had his jaw, his coloring, his eyes. They were walking, breathing, daily evidence of what had happened. And everyone on that plantation knew it. The enslaved people knew it. The plantation wife knew it. The neighbors who visited for Sunday dinners knew it and pretended not to. These children occupied an impossible position in the plantation hierarchy. They were enslaved, fully, legally, without exception. Their mother's status determined their condition, and their mother was enslaved, and so they were enslaved, regardless of the blood that ran in their veins. They could be, and frequently were, sold by the very man who fathered them. Some enslavers sold their own mixed-race children to raise cash or to silence the evidence of what they had done, or simply because they could. The formerly enslaved abolitionist and writer Frederick Douglass wrote about this dimension of slavery with searing clarity. He described how slaveholders could claim the profits of enslaved labor while simultaneously being the fathers of those they enslaved. He described the particular cruelty of watching a man treat his own children as property, because acknowledging them would be acknowledging the crime that produced them. For plantation wives, these children were a daily confrontation with a truth they were expected to absorb without reaction. Some recorded their private torment. The diaries and letters that have survived from plantation mistresses contain passages that, read carefully, reveal the strain of living in constant proximity to evidence they could not acknowledge. They write about the children in the quarters with a careful vagueness. They write about certain resemblances that trouble them. They describe feelings of shame that they cannot quite locate, a free-floating humiliation with no named object, because naming the object would require naming the crime. But here is the critical thing. In that private torment, the focus was almost never on the enslaved mother. It was almost never on what had been done to her, the violation, the coercion, the absolute absence of consent. The pain recorded in these diaries is the pain of the wife's wounded dignity, of her humiliation, of her sense of betrayal. The enslaved woman, the one who had actually been violated, appears in these accounts largely as an object of jealousy or resentment, not as a fellow human being who had been wronged. That distinction matters, because it tells us something about the limits of whatever sympathy plantation wives may have felt. They could feel pain about what their husbands had done. What they could not or would not do is see the enslaved women as full human beings, whose suffering was morally equivalent to their own. Or worse, there were exceptions. There are documented cases of plantation mistresses who quietly ensured that mixed-race children received somewhat better treatment, who may have recognized, without ever saying so, that these children had a claim on the household that could not be admitted but could sometimes be accommodated. But these were rare, and they changed nothing structural. A slightly better ration, a slightly less brutal assignment. These were not acts of justice. They were acts of guilty conscience, offered in secret, changing nothing about the system that made the crime possible. The children grew up enslaved, and many of them were eventually sold, often as their white fathers aged, and the evidence of their lives became inconvenient for the heirs who would inherit the plantation. The plantation, wife stayed silent, and the children lived, or didn't, with the consequences of that silence. Silence in the antebellum plantation household was not passive. It was actively constructed, deliberately maintained, and carefully transmitted from one generation to the next. Young women who grew up on plantations were trained in this silence from childhood. They were taught, by the example of their mothers and the explicit instruction of their social world, that certain things were not spoken of, that a lady did not notice the uglier realities of the household, that composure, the ability to move through horror without reacting, was a virtue, not a failure. This training was so thorough that many plantation wives may genuinely have convinced themselves on some level that what they saw was not what they saw. The human capacity for motivated blindness, for not seeing what it is, too costly to see, is real and well documented when the social, legal, and economic consequences of seeing something clearly are devastating. The mind develops remarkable tools for looking away. But the evidence in the diaries and letters suggests that for most plantation wives, the blindness was never complete. The knowing was always there in some form, beneath the performance of not knowing. It surfaced in the coded language they used with each other, in the bitterness that leaked through the careful prose of their private writing, in the particular cruelty some of them directed toward enslaved women, A cruelty that makes no sense unless you understand the resentment and shame that drove it. They also transmitted this silence to their daughters explicitly. Conversations about what happens in the quarters or the nature of men, or what a wife endures. These conversations happened, but they happened in code, and they passed the code on intact. The daughter who grew up on a plantation knowing, without ever having been told directly, what her mother knew, she was being prepared for the same silence that her mother kept. This was not unique to the Plantation South. The historian Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers, whose landmark 2019 work on enslaved women and the domestic economy of slavery draws on extensive primary sources, has documented how plantation wives were not passive bystanders to the economy of slavery. They were active participants, with their own economic investments and their own authority over enslaved people. The silence they kept about sexual violence was part of a broader pattern of active engagement with and benefit from a system whose full brutality they were trained to manage without acknowledging and visiting white women, neighbors, relatives, friends from other plantations participated in the same silence. When they sat in the parlors of plantation households and saw the evidence of what was happening, they said nothing. When they returned home and wrote letters to the hostess they had just visited, they said nothing. The silence was maintained across a whole social network, because the social network itself depended on the fiction the silence protected. But silence has limits, and in some corners of the antebellum South, women were beginning to find their voices, not to protect the fiction, but to tear it apart. The argument is sometimes made, in the defense of plantation wives, that they had no choice, that the constraints of their legal and social situation were so severe that silence was the only option available to them, that we cannot hold them responsible for failing to resist a system that had no mechanism for their resistance. The historical record does not support that argument, because some women who were born into exactly the same system refused it. Angelina Grimke and her sister Sarah Grimke grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, as the daughters of one of the state's most prominent slaveholders. They were raised inside the plantation world, surrounded by the violence, trained in the silence, prepared by birth and education to take their places in the social order that system created. They left, and they did not go quietly. By the 1830s, both sisters had moved north and had become among the most powerful abolitionist voices in the country. Angelina's 1836 pamphlet addressed to the Christian women of the South was a direct appeal to the very women they had grown up among, an appeal to see what they had been trained not to see and to act on what they knew. She was explicit about the sexual violence of slavery. She was explicit about the role of white women as witnesses to that violence, and she was explicit about the moral weight of their silence. The response in South Carolina was immediate. Copies of the pamphlet were burned. The Grimke family was threatened with arrest if Angelina ever returned to the state. The message of the response was clear. This was exactly the truth that the silence was designed to protect. Sarah Grimke went further. In her 1838 Letters on the Equality of the Sexes, she drew explicit connections between the oppression of white women under coverture and the oppression of enslaved women under slavery, while being careful to note that the situations were not equivalent, that enslaved women faced violence and terror that white women, constrained as they were, did not. She was wrestling publicly with exactly the contradiction that most plantation wives swallowed in private, that you could be both oppressed and complicit. That constraint did not eliminate moral responsibility. The Grimke sisters paid a price for their refusal. They were estranged from their family. They were attacked in the press. They were accused of being unwomanly, immodest, dangerous. Their abolitionist work was used to discredit the broader anti-slavery movement, and they persisted anyway. They are important not because they solved the problem, but because they proved that the silence was a choice, that Southern women who knew the truth had options other than accepting it, that the cage, real as it was not completely sealed. Other white women made similar choices in smaller, less public ways. women who quietly passed information about the Underground Railroad, women who found ways to protect individual enslaved, people from specific acts of violence even while remaining unable to challenge the system as a whole, women who, in the privacy of their own homes, refused to punish enslaved women for the crimes committed against them. These choices did not end slavery, but they matter because they prove that other choices were possible. And that means the women who made the opposite choice, who kept the silence, who punished the victims, who maintained the fiction, made a decision, not a forced one, a decision. We have spent considerable time examining the world from the perspective of the plantation wife, her constraints, her knowledge, her choices. But the center of this story is not her. The center of this story is the women she failed, enslaved women who were subjected to sexual violence by enslavers, existed in a world where every system designed to protect people from harm was either absent or actively hostile to them. They could not report. They could not refuse without facing brutal consequences. They could not seek help from the legal system that classified them as property. And as we have documented, they frequently could not seek help from the white women who managed their daily lives, because those women were either indifferent to their suffering or actively added to it, and yet they survived, and they resisted, and they kept records of what happened to them, not always in writing, but in the transmission of truth through memory, through community, through the stories they told their children and their grandchildren. The strategies enslaved women developed to navigate or resist sexual violence were as varied as the women themselves. Some sought relative safety and visibility, becoming indispensable to the household in ways that offered some protection, or cultivating relationships with older enslaved community members who might provide some buffer. Some sought protection in the networks of the enslaved community itself, in the watchfulness of other women, in the warnings passed quietly when the master's attention shifted. Some resisted in more direct ways, at enormous personal risk. There are documented accounts of enslaved women who fought back physically against assault, knowing that the consequence could be extreme violence, sale, or death. Some chose to terminate pregnancies they did not want, using botanical knowledge passed through generations at great risk to their own health. Some ran, knowing the odds were against them, taking the chance anyway, and some survived by enduring and by bearing witness, by remembering what happened, even when they were prevented from speaking it aloud, and by preparing their daughters to navigate the same world with more knowledge than they themselves had had. The most powerful testimonies of this history come from the women themselves, preserved in the narratives of formerly enslaved people, collected in the decades after emancipation, and in the small number of full memoirs that enslaved women managed to write and publish. Harriet Jacobs is among the most important of these voices. Born into slavery in North Carolina in 1813, Jacobs spent years being harassed and coerced by her enslaver before eventually escaping and ultimately gaining her freedom. Her memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, published in 1861, was one of the first published accounts by an enslaved woman of the specific sexual vulnerability of her situation. Jacobs wrote with extraordinary care and deliberate courage. She knew that her white female readers had been conditioned to see sexual coercion of any kind as a mark of moral degradation in the woman who experienced it, not the man who perpetrated it. She spent the early pages of her narrative addressing that assumption directly, explaining the conditions that made resistance and escape so difficult, asking her readers to withhold the judgment they were inclined to apply. And she was explicit about the role of the plantation mistress. Jacobs described her enslaver's wife not as an ally or a fellow sufferer, but as an additional source of danger. A woman who suspected what was happening, who watched Harriet with jealousy and resentment, who added to her burden rather than lightening it, who directed anger at the enslaved woman instead of at the man who held power over them both. Jacobs wrote about hiding in a crawl space above her grandmother's house for nearly 7 years, a space so small she could not stand upright, infested with insects, unbearably hot in summer and cold in winter, because it was safer than remaining within reach of her enslaver and his wife. 7 years, hidden, because the world outside offered no protection and the white women around her were more threat than help. Her story is not unique, it is representative. The narratives collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, interviews with elderly Black Americans who had been born into slavery, contain hundreds of accounts of enslaved women describing the sexual violence of the plantation system and the complete absence of protection from any quarter, including from the mistresses of the households where they lived and worked. These women did not need historians to tell them what had happened. They had lived it, and they had kept the memory of it alive across generations, waiting for a world that might finally be willing to hear. The Civil War ended in 1865. Slavery was abolished. And almost immediately, a project began to rewrite the history of what the antebellum South had been. We call this project the Lost Cause, the ideological movement that reframed the Confederacy, not as a slaveholders' rebellion, but as a noble defense of Southern culture and values. It produced monuments, textbooks, novels, films, and an entire cultural mythology that transformed the plantation South into a place of grace and honor, and transformed the people who enslaved others into figures of dignity and romantic tragedy. At the center of this mythology stood the plantation wife, recast not as a woman who had witnessed and enabled sexual violence against enslaved women, but as a figure of almost saintly virtue, the gracious hostess, the devoted mother, the long-suffering wife who endured hardship with quiet dignity. The reality of what she had known and chosen not to act on was erased entirely from this portrait. No single work did more to embed this mythology in American culture than Margaret Mitchell's 1936 novel Gone with the Wind and the 1939 film adaptation that followed it. The character of Scarlett O'Hara, willful, resourceful, ultimately surviving the collapse of the plantation world she loved, became one of the most iconic figures in American fiction. The plantation households of the novel are depicted as places of festivity and grace. The enslaved people are background figures, largely content, loyal, grateful. The sexual violence of the plantation system is entirely absent from the world of Gone with the Wind. There are no mixed-race children. On Tara, there is no terror in the slave quarters after dark. There is no wife sitting in the parlor knowing what her husband has done. Gone with the Wind was not simply a novel. It was a monument to the silence that plantation wives had kept, extended into American culture, and presented as beauty, as nostalgia, as a world worth mourning. The novel won the Pulitzer Prize. The film won 8 Academy Awards. It shaped how generations of Americans, including many Black Americans, first encountered the history of slavery. And what it told them was that the plantation South was complicated, maybe, but also beautiful, and that the women at the center of it were sympathetic figures. The enslaved women whose suffering made that world possible were decorative in this version of history, or absent. The Lost Cause mythology also shaped education. For much of the late 19th century and well into the 20th, Southern textbooks taught a version of slavery that minimized its violence, emphasized the supposed contentment of enslaved people, and portrayed slaveholders as paternalistic caregivers rather than what they actually were. This curriculum was not confined to the South. It shaped the understanding of American history that was transmitted to children across the country, and embedded in that curriculum was a portrait of the plantation mistress as a victim of the Civil War, a woman who had lost a way of life, rather than as a person who had benefited from and participated in a system of extraordinary brutality. Dismantling that mythology is not simply an academic exercise, it is a prerequisite for honest reckoning, because you cannot address the consequences of a history you have agreed to misrepresent. And the consequences of this history are not over. The sexual violence of the plantation era did not end with emancipation. Its consequences are present today, measurable, traceable, and profound. The most literal evidence of this is genetic. Modern DNA testing has given millions of Black Americans access to information about their ancestry that was systematically destroyed or concealed during slavery. When names were stripped, families were separated, and the records that documented what happened were kept by people who had every reason to keep them incomplete. What those DNA tests reveal, consistently and across hundreds of thousands of cases, is the genetic signature of the plantation era's sexual violence. Significant percentages of European ancestry in Black American genealogies, ancestry that was not the product of consensual relationships across racial lines, but of the systematic rape of enslaved women by the men who enslaved them. The geographical distribution of this genetic inheritance maps almost exactly onto the geography of the antebellum plantation economy. The states with the highest concentrations of enslaved people in the antebellum period show the highest rates of European genetic markers in contemporary Black American populations from those regions. The bodies of the descendants carry the record that the official records tried to erase. This is not an abstraction. When a Black American sits down with a DNA test result and discovers European ancestry they cannot account for through any known family history, they are encountering the direct consequence of a crime that was committed against their ancestors and never named, never prosecuted, never acknowledged by the people and the institutions that benefited from it. The silence of plantation wives contributed to the erasure of that crime from history. Because they were the witnesses, they were the people closest to what was happening. And they said nothing, not in ways that produced records, not in ways that named names or documented what occurred. Their silence helped ensure that what happened in those plantation households remained, officially, invisible. But genetic inheritance is only one dimension of the long shadow. The psychological inheritance of the plantation era's sexual violence passed through families in patterns of trauma, in particular vulnerabilities, in the ways that communities learn to protect their daughters and distrust authority, is harder to quantify, but no less real. The sociologists and psychologists and historians who have studied the long-term effects of mass trauma on communities have documented the ways that the specific violations of slavery left marks on Black American family and community life that have not simply healed with time, not because the descendants of enslaved people are broken. They are not. The resilience and creativity and strength of Black American culture is one of the most extraordinary stories in human history. But resilience does not mean that there are no wounds. It means that people found ways to survive and even flourish in spite of them, and the wounds have never been officially acknowledged. There has been no national reckoning with the sexual violence of the plantation era, no memorial, no formal acknowledgement by the descendants of slave-holding families. No curriculum that teaches this history with the clarity it deserves. The silence that plantation wives kept has been, in many respects, maintained by American culture for a century and a half. History asks us difficult questions. Some of the most difficult are the ones that do not have clean answers. The ones that force us to hold multiple truths at once, without resolving them into something simple. The question of plantation wives and their silence is one of those questions. It is true that they lived in a world that severely constrained their legal and social options. It is true that resistance carried real costs. It is true that the architecture of the plantation South was specifically designed to make women, both white and black in different ways, unable to challenge the power of men who held all the formal authority. And it is also true that they kept their silence, that some of them actively punished the victims of their husbands' crimes, that they benefited from the system, economically, socially, materially, and that their silence helped maintain the conditions under which enslaved women could be violated, without consequence. Both of these things are true at the same time, and we have to hold both of them. The framework of complicity, which is distinct from guilt, and even more distinct from simple blame, is useful here. Complicity does not require active participation in harm. It requires knowing about harm, having some capacity to affect it, and choosing not to. It is a structural relationship to wrongdoing, not necessarily an intentional one. Plantation wives were complicit in the sexual violence of the plantation system. They were not the perpetrators. They were not the architects of the system, but they were the witnesses who said nothing, the managers who punished victims, the women who kept the social fiction that allowed the violence to remain invisible. Understanding this does not require hating them. It does not require denying the real constraints they lived under. It requires being honest about what those constraints led them to do, and what the consequences of their choices were for the women who had no constraints at all, only captivity. The moral philosophy around complicity also asks us to look honestly at what choices were available, and the Grimke sisters and other abolitionist women who came from inside the plantation world demonstrate that choices existed, that the silence was not absolutely forced, that it was, within the real constraints of that world, a choice. Choices have moral weight, even choices made under pressure, even choices made by people who were themselves in some respects oppressed. The history of the world is largely a history of people who were oppressed in one direction choosing to oppress in another, because the power to do so was available to them and the cost of refusing it was too high. That pattern does not make the oppression acceptable. It makes it human, and understanding it as human as the product of recognizable fears and self-interests and moral failures is more honest and ultimately more useful than treating it as monstrous and therefore alien. Because if we treat it as alien, we do not have to reckon with the ways the pattern continues, with the bystanders in our own world who know about harm and say nothing, with the structures that reward silence and punish those who speak, with the ways that privilege, of any kind, in any era, can make the cost of the right choice feel prohibitive. The plantation wife is not a figure from the distant past. She is a mirror. We have spent this documentary examining a system, a silence, and the people who kept it. But before we close, we want to do something different. We want to name some of the women who were not silent, not the plantation wives, the enslaved women. Harriet Jacobs, who hid in a crawl space for 7 years rather than submit, who wrote her story with her own hands and published it so the world could not pretend. It did not happen. She did not have to do that. She had escaped. She was free. She went back into the most painful years of her life in the act of writing, so that her story would not be buried, so that what had been done to her and to women like her would be on the record. Harriet Tubman, who escaped slavery herself and returned 13 times to help others escape at constant personal risk, in defiance of every law and social force that said she had no right to freedom or to help others find it. Tubman also worked as a spy for the Union Army during the Civil War, leading the Combahee River raid that liberated more than 700 enslaved people in a single night. She was never paid by the Union government for her service. She spent the rest of her life fighting for the rights of black people and for women's suffrage. Sojourner Truth, born Isabella Baumfree, who was enslaved in New York and who escaped in 1826 with her infant daughter. Truth went on to become one of the most powerful voices for abolition and women's rights in the country, like delivering her famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech in 1851 before a women's rights convention, in which she challenged the white feminist movement to reckon with the specific experience of black women who were neither protected by the pedestal of white femininity nor exempt from the demands made on women in general. Ellen Craft, who escaped slavery with her husband, William, by disguising herself as a white male slaveholder. She was light-skinned enough to pass, while William posed as her enslaved servant. The ingenuity and courage this required is almost incomprehensible. If discovered at any point, both of them would have faced severe punishment or death. They made it. They escaped to the north, then to England, when the Fugitive Slave Act made the North unsafe, and they eventually returned to the United States after the Civil War to establish a school for black children in Georgia. These women, and the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands whose names we do not know, whose stories were not written down, whose survival and resistance left no record because the system that enslaved them had no interest in keeping one. They are the center of this story. They survived a world that treated them as less than human. They found ways to resist within that world. They kept truth alive when everything around them was designed to bury it. And they passed that truth forward to their children, to their communities, to us. The least we can do is repeat it. You might have watched this documentary and wondered, what is the point of going back into all of this? Slavery is over. The plantation South is gone. These specific women, both the ones who kept the silence and the ones who suffered for it, have been dead for generations. Why does it matter? It matters because the descendants of enslaved women are here, today living in a country that has never fully reckoned with what was done to their ancestors. It matters because the mythology that was built to protect the plantation wife's reputation, the lost cause, the romanticization of the antebellum South, the fiction of the gracious household continues to circulate in school curricula that soften the reality of slavery, in monuments to Confederate figures that still stand in public squares, in the persistent nostalgia for a way of life built on human captivity, in the lived experience of Black Americans who are still being told that their history is exaggerated, that their pain is politically motivated, that the past is the past, and it is time to move on. It matters because the pattern we have examined of knowing about systemic harm and choosing silence to protect personal comfort is not a historical artifact. It is a pattern that recurs in workplaces, in families, in communities, in institutions. The people who know and say nothing while harm continues are not confined to the antebellum plantation. They are everywhere, and understanding how that choice was made in one of its most consequential historical expressions is a way of recognizing it when it appears in other forms. And it matters because truth has value in itself. Because the enslaved women who were violated in those plantation households deserve to have what was done to them named plainly, without euphemism, without the protective softening of historical distance. They were real people. What happened to them was real. The silence that surrounded it was real. And the consequences of that silence, genetic, psychological, cultural, historical, are real and ongoing. Naming these things is not the same as solving them. It does not undo what was done. It does not repair the damage. But it is the beginning of something, because you cannot repair what you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot address what you agree to call by another name. You cannot heal what you insist did not happen. The plantation wife sat in her parlor and chose not to see what she saw. She protected the man who held power over everyone in that household, including, in many ways, herself, by keeping a silence that lasted well beyond her own life. The mythology built on that silence lasted well beyond her death. We do not have to keep it. We can choose to see what we are seeing. We can choose to name what we know. We can choose to honor the memory of the women who survived by making sure their story is told, fully, honestly, without looking away. That is not a comfortable choice. Truth rarely is, but it is the right one. And it is the one that the women at the center of this story, the ones who endured, who resisted, who survived, who remembered, it is the one they deserved a long time ago.